Hello. Universalizability is a meta-ethical principle that moral judgments be fair. It's applicable to any normative ethical theory, that being meta-ethical, it concerns the logical structure of moral concepts. Even utilitarianism is, universalizability is the core insight of the categorical imperative. You'll see that. You'll see the similarity very quickly. So that a utilitarian moral judgment would also have to be universalizable, which means it would have to be applicable to anyone. Schematically, there's the test for this is this. If R, some reason R, counts as a reason for some person S to perform some action A, then S would have to allow that R would also count as a reason for any similar person to perform a similar action under similar circumstances. So there are obviously, three kinds of similarity then: person, action, circumstances. Obviously, the weasel word here is similar. What counts as relevantly similar? And that's notoriously problematic, but we can just be concerned with the simple instances on either end. Say that Jones runs a traffic light to get his injured son to a hospital emergency room. If he had time to think about it, he would have to allow that it would also be justifiable for Ms. Smith to run a stop sign to get her injured child to a doctor's office. There you have similar people, both competent drivers, performing a similar action, violating a traffic regulation under similar circumstances, getting an injured child to help. That's pretty clear. On the other end, he wouldn't have to worry about it justifying, say, his 9-year-old son driving the family car to get an injured sibling to the hospital emergency room. There you don't have a similar person. Jones wouldn't have to worry about it justifying, say, Miss Smith's leaving her other preschool children at home unattended while she takes one of them to the emergency room. That's a different action. And he wouldn't have to worry about it justifying Miss Smith's running a traffic light to get her well child to a doctor's office in time for a routine medical examination. Different circumstances. Those are easy. It shades off in the middle, and that's where judgment is required in how we apply this. To understand the concept, let's look at John Mackey. Remember Mackey? He's the guy from which we borrowed our discussion of responsibility largely. Mackey, in the same book from which that came, his Ethics, has a nice chapter on universalizability. And Mackey analyzes the concept into 3 stages. He says it's possible to universalize all 3, 1 being the most basic and 3 being the most controversial. He's pretty clear that stages 1 and 2 are required by morality, but not at all clear that stage 3 would. Stage 3 would follow logically from the other 2, but it's not clear that morality would require it. So stage 1, rule out differences of number. And by this, he just means differences of bare identity, being one person rather than another person. This amounts to ruling out proper names as having general relevance in moral judgments. It's like legal documents where a person's name, we're referencing a person in general, we'll see names like John Doe, Jane Doe, Richard Roe. These are just variables. Plug any name you like in for that spot. Moral judgments work the same way. It should not matter who one is. One's reasons would be applicable to anybody in those circumstances and not just oneself. So if I do something sketchy and you ask me, well, why'd you do that? And I would say, well, because I'm Borowitz. that shouldn't impress you, right? What kind of reason is that? It isn't. That's the point. This would have a couple surprising consequences. One is it would rule out what he calls the inverted egoism of ascetics. Ascetics are usually religious people who deny themselves all kinds of earthly or worldly pleasures. So, say an ascetic might say, well, everyone else in the world can eat Twinkies, but not me. Not that we would care about that, but we could ask him, well, what's so special about you that makes that judgment relevant to you, but not to others? More interestingly, it would rule out certain varieties of patriotism. So the super patriot who might say, everybody in the world ought to support the interests of the United States. Well, that has a proper name in it, United States, though it would not be universalizable. Had he had in mind instead, everybody in the world ought to support the interests of his or her own country, well, that is universalizable. There is no proper name there. The point is that by getting rid of the proper name, we get rid of reference to particularity. That's nothing to do with moral judgments. If we go back to my saying, well, because I'm Borrow, it's not that has something to do with my role, then of course it would apply to anybody in that role and not to me as an individual. We have to watch out for, let's say we got a super Italian patriot who listens to all this and he says, okay, I get it. Everybody in the world ought to support the interests of boot-shaped countries. It's true, there's no proper name there, but that's just a dodge for not using it. If he really believed that, geographical boundaries, topography of a country has something to do with its value, then okay, well, it's kind of strange, but it might be universalizable. In which case, maybe a reunited Korea would get special treatment too. Well, this doesn't get us very far. I mean, this is very basic. It's just ruling out the significance of the identity that of this person being this person, this particular individual, this package of protoplasm, rather than this one. That's not morally significant. Most of the work that gets done happens at stage 2. In stage 2, we rule out differences of personal characteristics. Now, this should be familiar. This is what most of what happened behind Rawls's veil of ignorance. So, age, gender, ethnicity, cognitive and physical capacities, all of those would be accommodated by stage 2. The kind of unfairness that happens here that stage 2 is trying to rule out happens when people try to adopt moral principles which favor people like themselves. And this doesn't have to be obvious. This happens a lot, and it isn't obvious. I mean, I think we do this a lot. For example, if somebody who's strong or has sufficient resources might endorse strong competition. Somebody who's good at weapons might say, well, I think we ought to bring back dueling to resolve disputes. What we do here, what we're doing in stage 2 is trying to see the world from the perspective of somebody else. We're trying to put ourselves into someone else's shoes. This is a very important part of morality, and one that requires imagination. It may be that most unfairness happens because people aren't exercising sufficient imagination. In stage 2, we look for decisions or judgments that we're prepared to make not only to everybody, but to everybody however they change, and in ways that are difficult to imagine. So, for example, let's say that we have a TV station reporter who's out doing interviews on the street, and the question is, how shall we pay for healthcare? So She asks a guy who's in his 20s, fit, single, has good health insurance, or rather, no, not health insurance necessarily. Let's say she just he's in his 20s, fit, single. How should we pay for health care? Says, well, I think we should pay out of pocket. Now, she might ask, the reporter might ask him, well, what if you were in your 40s and your job wasn't very secure and you have a number of children, one of whom needs a surgical procedure? Well, if he's a fair-minded guy, he might say, oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, maybe we should have universal coverage. This is what's required of morality when we're able to reflect about it. Yeah, there's a problem with this, though. You see, let's take the same example. So she's already spoken to the 20-year-old guy, now a guy in his 20s. Now she goes down the street and she finds the guy in his 40s who were actually in those circumstances, that his job isn't very secure. He has a number of children, one of whom needs a surgical procedure. And she asks him, what do you think? How should we pay for health care? And he immediately says, well, I think we should have universal coverage. She would have to say to him, well, wait a minute, what if you were in your 20s and fit and singles? You see where that leaves us? It's from the view subspecie aeternitatis, sometimes, so the view from nowhere, or rather the view from everywhere at once. And there is no such point of view. So let's say she continues down the street, and who does she meet but Kant? He says, Kant, how should we pay for health insurance? And Kant says, whatever you do, make sure that you could allow anyone else in your circumstances to do the same thing. And the reporter says, well, that's not helpful, Kant. Now, this shows us what it means for both utilitarianism and Kant's theory to be narrow sense moral theories. What you're supposed to do with the categorical imperative is have something in mind already, a reason. So if we're talking about health care, we should have a policy for paying for health care in mind already. Then we take it to the categorical imperative and see if it passes the test. It's not fair to go to Kant with just empty-handed. That's not how the categorical imperative works. That's not how universalization works. All right, this is pretty powerful. Stage 2 goes a long way to mitigating the kinds of unfairness that stage 1 failed to account for. We can imagine ourselves in another's place with respect to their abilities, their resources, their social position, their interests. But it does not yet account for something else. Let's take stage 3. Stage 3 asks us to rule out differences of preference. Now, this should sound familiar. This sounds like Rawls again. Remember, Rawls said that he recognized that most of our interests depend on other characteristics that we have. Like we like to do what we're good at, what we're talented in. George Bernard Shaw, the Irish playwright, said about the golden rule, do not do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Their tastes may be different than yours. That's what's going on, tastes, preferences. Stage 3, then, requires a more thorough job of doing what was going on at stage 2. To the extent that we not only try to see the world from somebody else's point of view, we become that person. Now, the problem at this point, Mackey says, is that in doing that, hardly anything is left of oneself. Rather, again, what we're trying to do is to see things from the point of view of everyone at once. And Mackey says it's doubtful that any principle or particular moral judgment can pass the test, that's severe. There are basic interests, desires that everybody has, but then those that separate us, which are the most obstinate. He says that it's this, if stage 3 is, it's not at all clear that morality would take us that far. Why would that be? Yeah, take a silly example. Let's say, we have somebody, those animated years ago, creatures, Smurfs, kind of blue things. We have somebody who hates Smurfs. He believes you find any Smurf, crush it immediately. All Smurfs should be exterminated. Now, what if somebody said, well, wait a minute. You're looking kind of blue around the gills yourself. Maybe we'd find some Smurf ancestry in your DNA. What would you say then? And he thinks for a moment and he says, well, if that's the case, then I and my family should be exterminated. And he means it. You see the extremity of that. What he's doing, he's taking us down stage 3. He's working with a preference that he does not, with characteristics he does not in fact have. But he's imagining if I did have those characteristics, I have a more basic preference, which would require this, which would require something that we might think morally wrong. So that's Mackey's reason for thinking that stage 3 is something that maybe morality doesn't require of us, but it falls out of the first two, simply logically. Again, Rawls's veil of ignorance does much of what the work of stage 2 and 3 are doing. Finally, let's take this through an example. Imagine somebody who has a second shift job, lives out in maybe Ozaki County somewhere, and is returning home. It's a miserable night. It's all kinds of precipitation falling out of the sky, including freezing rain and so on. He just wants to go home and go to bed. But up ahead on the county road, he sees a car in the ditch with its flashers on. Now, the question that arises is, should I stop and help? He just wants to go home. But so he does a quick piece of first stage universalization. If I physically, the driver says, were in the ditch, would I want to be helped? So again, rule out differences of number, bare identity, just putting yourself as you are in the position of the other person. And he thinks, well, if I were in the ditch, I'd want to be helped. Now, and so he could not universalize the maxim drive on. But notice, since what we're doing is placing him as he is in the ditch, he could say, well, that's impossible. It would never happen. I'm much too good a driver for that ever to happen. If that's the case, then he could drive on. All right, let's suppose he does. First stage of universalization fails to stop him. But now he proceeds to the second stage. He has to imagine that he has characteristics that he does not in fact have, that he's a worse driver than he actually is. It takes some imagination. It's kind of hard for him to do, but he says, okay, okay, if I were in the ditch, then I would want somebody to stop and help. If in the impossible event he were to get stuck, he'd want someone to help. So trying to find a maxim that doesn't take special notice of his own common sense, good driving skills, he would conclude that the maxim can't be drive on, but stop and help. Notice that at that stage, the conclusion doesn't rest on any duty that he in fact should have to be helped. That question doesn't arise. It would never happen. He would never get in the ditch. It doesn't rest on the actual qualities that he has. It rests on some more basic preference that he would have. That doesn't depend on his characteristics. Yeah, if I found myself in a ditch, I guess I would well be helped. And that takes us to stage 3. Now, what if he's one of those guys who would never ask for help? Imagine days before GPS. There were guys who would never ask for directions. Drive other people in their car nuts. Never stop at a gas station and ask for directions. He thinks that asking for help is contemptible. But he understands that other people don't, and that those people are pretty reasonable in most respects, just that he differs from them on mutual aid. So in proceeding to the third stage, he decides that not everyone shares his ideal of self-reliance. There are people who don't mind being more dependent on each other. And he takes that into account. That's stage 3. But again, this is pretty extreme. I mean, the stopping and help to asking for help is not a big deal, but there are other things that are things that people are willing to die for, that they would have to rule out because other people don't share those beliefs. Morality requires that. Morality through universalization required, if fairness demands this. Fairness demands that we consider at least stage 3, and this is why it's controversial, that fairness of the extreme form at stage 3 requires that we put our most deeply held values aside, that we be able to weigh them against what's required of other people, that other people don't have these values, and that they're not essential to my own decision. Universalization is. Mackey says of the third stage, maybe it is useful in, it's not possible to see the world from all points of view at once, that maybe what it's asking for is that we compromise, that we understand that other people that we have. I think the abortion debate is a good one, that it's still perhaps the most polarizing social issue in the country, has been for decades. It used to be that, we hear about it so occasionally, that somebody will plant a bomb in front of an abortion clinic or shoot abortion providers. Now, if often abortion opponents will use the rhetoric of murder, says it's murder. Abortion is murder. If they truly believe that, then wouldn't one do whatever it takes to stop murder from routinely happening in that place, if that's what it is? But we don't see these events very much. Is it because abortion opponents are cowards? No, I don't think so. I think it's that they don't really think that it's murder, that the people who disagree with them are reasonable people in most sense. But on this, that's a complete polarization of views. It's morality that allows us to get around those sorts of differences. So universalization is absolutely characteristic of morality itself. Stages 1 and 2 are pretty clearly demanded by morality. Stage 2 sounds kind of innocuous. Imagine not having characteristics that you have. That's difficult to do. I myself think that stage 1 is maybe as far as most people can and do go. But morality does require that we go at least to stage 2. Stage 3 is considerably more radical.